I don't know anyone from the 1930s. Like, I just don't. And I guess I don't mean that, like, personally. Like, I don't mean that I don't personally know anybody from the 1930s. Though if you're asking, hey, Drew, do you know anyone personally from the 1930s? The answer is also no. But, like, in general, like, I am unfamiliar with that decade of world history, of U.S. history. It's just, like, there's not a lot going on, it feels like. And so I don't know much of anyone. So I guess, like, if I had to do it, I could probably name like 4 or 5 baseball players because I know a lot of baseball players. And I think probably, like, if you gave me one of those like high school multiple choice tests, I could maybe by process of elimination tell you who the president was. Presidents were? Yeah, no? President was? I don't know. Like, I could probably do it because I know like other decades. But like for the most part, there are 2 billion people alive in the world in the 1930s, and I know virtually none of them, with a notable exception. I know a lot about Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde. Everyone knows a lot about Bonnie and Clyde. We all are aware of Bonnie and Clyde, the famous bank robbers who really were less bank robbers and more just robbers who happened sometimes to hit banks. And they were actually more, robbers who happened to hit banks who also just like went through this killing spree of just murdering all sorts of people. Like, mainly police, but also they absolutely killed civilians and citizens, and they didn't care. They were criminals. And I think that's a little weird. If you think about it, it's odd. Like, I know about no scientists from the 1930s. I know, like, no Christian leaders. Like, I don't know any, like, I'm a preacher. I feel like I know a fair amount about church history. I know about absolutely no Christian missionaries or pastors or teachers or whatever from the 1930s. I just don't. I don't know anything about, like, humanitarians or, people, scientists, teachers, people who did good for the world, I know nothing about any of them, but I know a whole lot about a couple that are bank robbers and murderers. That's odd on its face. But I think, we are all kind of in this position. Because the fact is, we've had movies made about Bonnie and Clyde. I literally just watched one this week on Netflix that just came out called Highwaymen. It's very good. You should watch it. It's there. It just came out. Like, it's 2019, and we're still making Bonnie and Clyde movies. Before there were movies, there were plays, there were songs, there was all this stuff. I mean, there is literally every year at the site where Bonnie and Clyde were killed, there is a festival, the Bonnie and Clyde Festival, that is not like a thing you go to and you learn about how bad Bonnie and Clyde were. It's a thing you go to celebrate how cool Bonnie and Clyde were. You know what I mean? Like, it's a weird thing. You can right now for, like $5 or something, go take a selfie with the car they were in when they got shot. You can do that right now. Bonnie and Clyde are still famous today. And I think it's a little weird. But it's not weird in the sense of this. In their day, Bonnie and Clyde were the most famous Americans in our country. For the 3 years they were doing their thing, they were the single most famous people in our country. And I don't mean infamous. I don't mean like people knew about them and were scared. No, people protected them. Like, if they showed up in your town, you protected them because you liked them. But of course, begs the question of why. Some of it, super obvious, okay? Bonnie and Clyde were young, and they were attractive. And if there is anything that we have learned from the age of social media, it is that we will forgive literally everything about a person if they are young and attractive. Like, we do not care about anything if they are young, if they are attractive, especially if they are both. I mean, we will obsess over them in crazy ways, no matter what sort of person they are. They also were in love. And if there's anything every terrible movie for the last 30 years has taught us, it's that, man, we love a love story, even if it's a bad one. We are obsessed with people being in love. And so you put those two things together, young, attractive, they're in love, and we're like, yeah, it doesn't matter if they're murderers, that's fine. It doesn't matter that, like, if I owned, a service station or a store or whatever, that, like, they would rob me. We like them Like, we don't care about that. But there was actually one more massive piece to this puzzle that I think made Bonnie and Clyde go from famous then to famous forever. And that's this. They were seen actually not as criminals, but they were seen as heroes. They did their dirty work during the Great Depression, the worst economic time in our history, a time when people lost everything, lost their businesses, lost their farms, lost all of their money, and they blamed the banks. And so Bonnie and Clyde were sort of seen like Robin Hood, if Robin Hood had just kept all the money and bought drugs with it. It was sort of a different Robin Hood, but sort of a Robin Hood figure where they were going after the people that most American people were angry with. Most Americans were so angry at the situation that they were in. They were so angry at the banks and the entire economy that this young couple, this young, attractive couple that is in love, hitting banks all over the Midwest, for them, they thought, man, these people are just swell. People loved them. When they died, this is a crazy number to me. When they died, more than 35,000 people went to their funerals. 35,000. This isn't a world without cars, guys. Like their funerals were in Dallas. Think of the logistics of during the Great Depression in 1934 getting to Dallas. And yet people did it. Like they got on like a train or something. I have no idea if they did it. A horseback? What did they do with the 30s? As we've discussed, I don't know a lot about the 30s. But it wasn't as simple as just getting in the car or jumping on a plane. Like they rearranged their lives. 35,000 people at these funerals. They were that beloved because they were young and attractive and in love, and they attacked the banks. It was just the perfect storm. And all of this brings me to my point. Human beings are terrible judges of character. We are the worst. I mean, really, we say that terrible people, evil people, wicked people, we look at those people and we clap. And we look at other people that are good and are doing wonderful things for the world, and we say, yeah, we don't care. Or sometimes even worse, we say, yeah, I found 2 or 3 things I don't like about them. They may not be young and attractive. They may not be attacking banks. They may not be in love. So, I don't like it. We call bad people good people. We call good people bad people, and then we're proud of ourselves on the back end of it. And we have festivals for people 80 years later. We are terrible judges of character. We call evil good, and we call good evil. We run away from the people we should be embracing, and we embrace the people we should be running away from. And I bring that up because the fact of the matter is this. When Jesus was crucified, he was executed as a terrorist. It's true. Jesus was killed as a terrorist. He had another terrorist on his right crucified with him. He had another terrorist on his left crucified with him. And sometimes we call these people thieves. Like we often talk about the thief on the cross. But that really underscores who these people actually were. The best term for us that we would look at is terrorist. These people were rebelling against the government. These people were attempting to overthrow and take down said government. And these people were doing so using violence and bloodshed and fear. I don't know what else to call them other than terrorists. And when God became a man and showed the world goodness and love and peace and mercy and compassion, we did that terrible thing where we were the worst judges of character ever, and we said, nah, that dude's a terrorist. Let's kill him. We are terrible judges of character. And to understand why, to exactly get a good feel for why that's what Jesus was killed as, and what was going on, and why people were like this, we need to sort of rewind. We need to understand some first century and maybe some pre-first century political realities. So maybe 20 to 25 years before the birth of Jesus, there was this king named Herod. He called himself great, so he called himself Herod the Great. Herod was a king in name only. Like, he wasn't someone that the Jews liked, and he wasn't really even someone that, the Romans liked so much as he was just very opportunistic. Herod the Great put himself in a place during a time where Rome was ruling over Israel. And he said, I'll tell you what, I will do your bidding in my homeland, Rome. He went to them and he said, this is what I will do. I will rule, you make me king, and your will be done at all times. And Rome said, well, that's way better than, us risking somebody else's neck out there, so yeah, go for it. And so Herod was his puppet king. He did the bidding of Rome while the Jews hated him for obvious reasons. So Herod kind of, during his reign, one by one, day by day, little by little, introduced foreign Roman influences into every part of life. And the people hated it. The people, they didn't want foreign influence. They wanted to be Jews. They wanted to be Israel. They didn't want to be occupied Rome. But Herod kept saying, no, this is what's good for you. This is what's good for you. What he meant was, this is what's good for me, but he kept saying, this is what's good for you. And he tried to convince the people to follow him, and some did, but for the most part, it wasn't happening. But things didn't get real ugly. The people they pushed back, but in sort of peaceable ways, until Herod did something that was a little too far. You see, the temple of God was still under construction. Was still being built. Temple of God within Jerusalem. And so Herod decided, well, I'm just going to go ahead and make an addition to the blueprints. I'm going to put a golden eagle at the entrance. Now you might think, well, that sounds cool. Eagles are swell. I like gold. But you see, a golden eagle, that is the sign of the Caesar. That is essentially the seal of the Roman military complex. That's what this is. Herod put an eagle at the front of the temple, which was his way of saying, you may believe in God, you may pray to God, you may sacrifice to God, you may do all the things you want with God, but everything in your religion and in your faith is under the watchful eye of Rome. Everything you do is going to be watched over by the Caesar, and he is the Son of God. That was a field too far. The people looked at that and said, we cannot handle this. We can't take this. And so there was a group of men who decided, let's kind of gather everybody together. Let's get everybody around, and let's do something about this. And they went and they took down the eagle. They broke it, they melted it down, they got rid of it completely. And the religious people of Israel were ecstatic that they were pushing back. Herod looked at this, and maybe planning that this was going to happen, said, okay, cool, let's get control right back. He gathered up the leaders, he brought them publicly in front of everyone, and he lit them on fire. He burned them alive. And so that's what's going to happen to any rebellion that we ever see again. People don't respond well to that. And so the seeds of something much bigger were planted. Even though this was squashed, something much bigger was planted. And that much bigger sort of came to fruition a couple decades later when Jesus was just a little kid. You see, there was going to be this tax. There was this governor by the name of Quirinius. And Quirinius said, I want to tax the people. And so he issued a decree that I'm going to tax everyone. Here's the funny thing about Quirinius, though. Quirinius was the Roman governor of Syria. And he sent word that he was going to tax the people of Judea. I know some of you guys may not be awesome at geography. If so, that's okay. Me neither. But let it be known, Syria and Judea are not the same place. Syria and Judea, they don't overlap at all. Quirinius was not the governor of Judea. And yet he sent men and soldiers and a decree saying, I'm going to tax you. It's funny what makes people unhappy. The Jews had said, fine, we'll pay your taxes, but only the one who's actually in our place. For whatever reason, and I get it, but it is a little funny when you think about it, they decided, look, I am not paying taxes to that Roman governor over Syria. I will pay taxes to my Roman governor, thank you. The only reason Quirinius did this was because he was greedy and he could. It wasn't remotely legal even by Roman law. But he could, because no one could stop him. No one except for a man by the name of Judas. When we say Judas, we shouldn't think of, the Judas who betrays Jesus. It's a very common name. That's like Hank back in the day. Like, there's a lot of Hanks. Or there were in the 70s. I know a lot about that era. Judas was a guy from Galilee. Judas of Galilee is what his name is. Is full, what everybody knows him as. It's Judas of Galilee said, nope. Remember that rebellion we had like 20 years ago? Yeah, let's repeat that. And he says, okay, no one in Judea is paying taxes at all to any Roman anyone. We're done with the taxes. We're done. And a lot of the people accepted that and said, great. We don't like paying taxes. We don't like those guys anyway. Quirinius is the worst. Let's not deal with him. But there were other people who were like, no, let's do what Rome says. By the way, that's sort of the debate you see all throughout the first century in Israel is what do we do with Rome? There's some people who are very pro-Roman, and there are other people that are very not, and this is sort of the seeds of that. And that's when Judas had a choice. What sort of people do we want to be? What sort of rebellion do we want to have? And you see, this is where things get tricky. Because we live in a world where we see two groups of people, and we feel like we got to pick one. And it's funny because, like, okay, so we pick one, and then somebody says, well, the one you picked is terrible, and you say, yeah, but what about this one I didn't pick? And we do that, like, forever, about all things. Like, across the board, this is what we do. We are brilliant side pickers, while at the same time, terrible judges of character. My God, do we need help? Anyway. So we have these two sides. Rome, clearly bad. Judas, not so clearly bad, until he decides, I better fight fire with fire. I better fight fire with fire. Literally. Judas said, if you're not on my side, I will burn your house down with you in it. And he did that a few times. And he took people's property, and he took people's livestock, and he said, there, can't tax what you don't have. And suddenly, we now have two sides that are terrible. We have the Romans that are terrible. And now we have Judas and his terrorists that are also terrible. Eventually, Rome was able to put the rebellion down. They did so by basically getting Judas and killing him, because that's what Rome does. But there were too many of his followers to kill all of them. Like, they took what they could, but a new political party in Israel was formed that day, or that era, and they were called the Zealots. And for the next 60 years, the Zealots, in the name of Judas of Galilee, fought back against Rome using the same tactics that Rome used. Rome came in and killed. Rome came in with violence and bloodshed and fire. And so when the Zealots fought back, they killed. They pushed back with violence and bloodshed and fire. And there's no good side now. You have a tyrannical empire, and you have terrorists who act just like the tyrannical empire. But you see, people are people. We like to pick sides. And so the Zealots grow, and people support the Zealots. And for 60 years, until there's enough of a battle, enough of a war, that everything comes to a head, until then, you've got all sorts of battles and skirmishes and difficulties between these people. Jesus is arrested right kind of in the middle of that era. Right 25, 30, 35, ish years after all this. It's all a little murky on the exact dates. And when they arrested him, the Jews arrest him, and they take him to Pontius Pilate, the governor over the whole region. And they say, hey, listen, Pilate, we would like you to do our dirty work here and get rid of Jesus. There is literally nothing Pilate wants to do less than kill someone like Jesus. For Pilate, this is absolutely getting in the middle of what he sees as a local squabble. He sees this as getting in the middle of something he doesn't want to put his foot into. He doesn't want to put his nose in this. He has much bigger issues than what's going on in Israel. He just wants to keep peace. And this creates a problem for the religious leaders who have just arrested Jesus. And so this is their solution to that problem, as we read in the Gospel according to Luke. We read this. Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. They began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and claiming that he is the Messiah, a king. He is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. Oh, is he a Galilean? Pilate asks. You see, that is called manipulation. Jesus is not a zealot. Jesus is not a terrorist. But there was one thing Rome had to do in the middle of this 60-year difficulty, struggle between the zealots and the people that were on the ground there. Pilate has to keep peace there. He does not want to be a part of a local skirmish. But if you say Jesus says he's a king, like that he instead of Herod is a king, the Herod family is who the Romans have put in place, Jesus is claiming Herod's not that guy anymore, well, now you got to do something. And if you say, listen, he's just like that Judas guy, he's a Galilean, and he says not to pay your taxes. Every Roman governor throughout the empire knew exactly what that meant. We cannot have another Judas of Galilee revolt. We cannot have these people burning homes and farms to the ground. And so Pilate reluctantly puts the trial forward. Man, I guess if that's who he is, if he's really a Galilean, if he's really saying no taxes, if people are rioting, all right. And so he puts the trial forward. He sends them off to Herod. He brings them back here, and all these things happen. Very complicated. It's all nonsense. At the end of that, Pilate gives his verdict to not only the council, the religious leaders, but also the crowd of people that followed them. And here's where we read once again in Luke chapter 23. Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders, along with the people. And he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence, and I find him innocent. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I will have him flogged, and then I will release him. Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Here's what happens. They put him on trial, and Pilate says, none of that's true. I find less than no evidence that anything you're saying is anything. I'm going to punish him and get rid of him, and we're going to be done. And the people, who are terrible judges of character, say no. You see, as we read elsewhere in the scriptures, there's sort of this tradition that this time of year, the Romans, to kind of pacify the people, would release a prisoner of the people's choosing to kind of, you throw a dog a bone. The people, knowing this, use it. And they say, we want to cash that chip in. You've got a zealot, a leader. You've got an actual terrorist, a guy who is plotting to and leading a revolt to overthrow the government. He's a murderer. He is guilty. You've got him, and we want him back. And you've got a crucifixion. You've got a cross with his name on it. Put Jesus on it. And now Pilate is really in a spot. Because he knows if he doesn't do that, the people will riot. And he knows they're right that this is something he's going to do at some point, letting somebody go. And so it came to be that Jesus dies on the cross of Barabbas with Barabbas' terrorist buddies. People are terrible judges of character. It's possible that many in the crowd loved Barabbas because, like we talked about, people pick sides, and we will justify anything if our side is the one that's going to get the win. We'll justify anything, any horrible action, as long as we get the W. And so, yeah, the Zealots had a lot of fans. Because, yeah, okay, fine, they kill and they steal and they're just as violent and bloodthirsty and terrifying as the empire, but there are terrifying people. So it's possible a lot of people loved Barabbas. It's also just as possible that they saw Barabbas as being terrible, but they saw Jesus as being worse. And that one is what scares me more. That they knew who Barabbas was. They knew how difficult things were. They knew how horrible the Zealots actually lived. And they said, yeah, but we prefer that to Jesus. Either way, when Jesus was crucified, he was executed as a terrorist, with a terrorist on one side and another terrorist on another. And the people laughed. And they mocked him, and they called him names, and of course that's all sort of irrelevant when you've got nails in your wrists and feet, but still the people made their will known, including one of the terrorists on one side. But there was an exception, and that was the other terrorist. And I don't know what it was about the proceedings. I don't know if he was really always kind of a good dude, and in this case, he was just lumped in with the others. I don't know if he was like the worst ever, and now he sees the proceedings and he's like, this is all, nonsense. I don't know. But he looked at his friend and he says, hey man, like we're actually guilty, that guy's not. That's supposed to be Barabbas, man. Like this guy was not one of us. He was not one of us at all. I know he wasn't there. You know he wasn't there. He's innocent. We're guilty. Have you no respect for like any sort of decency or God's will or God's word or anything? Have you no decency? And then he asked Jesus a question. And this is maybe the only interaction between the two of them, but this is what we read. For the last time in the gospel according to Luke, this is what we read. Then the terrorist said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. We're at the first point in our story where we have good judgment of character. You see, because the audacity of this guy to ask that question to Jesus. I mean, really think about that. This guy, honestly, for whatever reason, maybe it's just a shot in the dark, but this guy has confidence enough to say, this guy is really good. This Jesus has something figured out I don't. Why he would ever think Jesus would give him an affirmative answer, why he would ever think Jesus would say yes, is beyond me. Other than this, the only guy in this crowd who has judged Jesus correctly is the terrorist who's dying and says, Jesus, give me grace. Remember me. This guy saw how good Jesus was, how compassionate, how merciful, how loving. What everyone else missed, this dying terrorist, he gets it. And that is the light of God in our darkest moments, our darkest place. We killed Jesus. We killed God in the flesh. It's the worst thing humanity has ever done. But in the midst of that, God shows his love and light and mercy. And to this one guy, the one solitary guy who seems to judge Jesus correctly, we see that grace. Our second lesson from a light in the darkest place is this. Jesus' kingdom is for all who recognize the goodness of God, even the worst of humanity. Let me say that again. Jesus' kingdom is for anyone, everyone, all who recognize the goodness of God, even the worst of humanity. We began talking about Bonnie and Clyde. We continued talking about other people. And at the end of the day, man, people are terrible judges of character. Terrible judges of character. We run from the good. We embrace the bad, and we think we're doing the right thing. And unfortunately, in the church, we're 2,000 years into this almost. It's not just a problem with like regular folk and other people. This is a problem with Jesus. I've been a Christian going 22 years now. I've been paying attention to how people use Jesus for the last 2 decades. And I'll be honest, I've seen a lot of shenanigans. I mean, like I've seen preachers explain that, Jesus' message is really be afraid of God because he wants to hurt you forever for fun. And we teach that and call that the good news. I've seen a lot of people talk about how using the name of Jesus, they look at Jesus and say, well, Jesus, he only blesses my denomination, my group of people. If you go to a church like mine, cool, but if you don't... I've seen other people who's screaming from the rooftops that anybody who was born differently than them or anybody who believes differently from them, anybody who acts differently from them, well, God doesn't like them because they were born different and they believe different and they act different. I've seen all manner of politicians say, Jesus wants me to do this agenda. And then somebody on the other side saying, Jesus wants me to do this agenda. And then somebody in the middle saying, Jesus wants me to do this agenda. And everybody cheers because they said Jesus. I mean, I've seen charlatans say, well, Jesus wants you to be wealthy, and if you're poor, well, I guess he doesn't love you. And the tricky thing is this, we're all saying Jesus. But what we have to understand is when Jesus was crucified, there was a crowd looking Jesus square in the face. They saw Jesus. And almost everyone did something else than what they should have. Some of them mocked him, some of them laughed at him, some of them, felt pity for him, so a lot of different things. Almost everyone looked at Jesus and came to the wrong conclusion about Jesus. How we judge Jesus' character matters so much. And that's why even though the guy was absolutely terrible, objectively awful, please don't hear me ever say that this terrorist crucified next to Jesus was a good guy. He was not. But we're supposed to be like him. We are called to be like him and to look at Jesus, and when the crowds are saying one thing, say, you know what? I see goodness. I see mercy. I see love. I see someone that I can come to and ask for help, and he'll say yes. That's the gospel. That's Christianity. That's Jesus. And when all is said and done, if that's not what we have, then we're missing something. This morning, the musicians are going to come forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation to take God up on his offer as he is. And as he is good. There is nothing that we can believe that changes the goodness of God. There is no rejection of him that can change the goodness of God. All of those opinions, all of the shouting people about Jesus, they have not changed the goodness of God as shown in Jesus. Our opinions about Jesus are irrelevant to his nature. And that is such good news. Because he is truly only ever good. And so we're called to embrace him, to accept that's who he is, and to live our lives by grace in faith. If you've never made a decision, the Bible teaches that we are to repent and be baptized, to turn our backs on who we used to be. In baptism, picture that in the water as we go down in the water and we are born again, raised out is the picture. You never made the decision. We can do it anytime. Nice warm baptistry. Let's talk. If you're already an immersed believer in Christ, you're looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it. We do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, we want to call, we want to cultivate, we want to meet new people, we want to share the gospel, we want to grow up while we do it, and at the end of the day, no matter what, we want to understand and live for the goodness of Christ. Not for some people, but for everybody. Not living like the Romans, but living like him. As we stand and as we sing.